The room was already quiet when I walked in. Not the casual quiet of people waiting, but the kind where everyone had agreed without saying it out loud that nothing unnecessary would be spoken. The briefing room at brigade headquarters always felt colder than the rest of the building, even when the thermostat said otherwise. I stopped at the edge of the table, heels together, back straight, hands locked where they were supposed to be. My sister didn't look up right away. Colonel Rebecca Carter was seated at the head of the table, uniform. Perfect rank, clean, not a crease out of place. To her left sat the brigade executive officer. To her right, the legal liaison, already flipping through a thin folder like he'd read it enough times to know what was coming, but not enough to stop it. "Captain Carter," Rebecca said finally, her voice steady and professional. No hesitation, no warmth, no hint that we shared a last name. "Yes, ma'am." She gestured to the empty chair across from her. I didn't sit. Sitting makes things feel like a conversation. This wasn't one. Rebecca nodded once, then read from the paper in front of her. Not the whole thing, just the parts she wanted on record. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of command." There it was, clean, simple, final. No one else spoke. The executive officer kept his eyes down. Legal stopped flipping pages. Rebecca continued. "This decision was made due to ongoing concerns regarding your attitude." I waited for the rest of the sentence. There wasn't one. No dates, no incidents, no examples, just attitude, a word that meant everything and nothing at the same time. "Yes, ma'am," I said. She looked up at me then, just briefly, as if checking to see whether I would react. I didn't give her anything. No questions, no pushback, no visible frustration. If that disappointed her, she didn't show it. "You will turn over command to your executive officer immediately," she said. "Your access credentials will be updated today. You are reassigned pending further administrative review." Administrative review. That part was new, but not unexpected. "Understood, ma'am." The legal liaison cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, and slid the folder across the table. "You'll need to sign acknowledging receipt of the order." I stepped forward, took the folder, and scanned it. The language was standard. The kind of language people stopped really reading once they'd seen it a dozen times. I didn't rush. I didn't stall either. I signed where it told me to sign, initialed, where it asked, and slid it back. Rebecca watched the entire time. She didn't interrupt. She didn't explain. She didn't soften anything. When I was done, I closed the folder and handed it back to legal. "That will be all," she said. I came to attention and saluted. She returned it automatically, muscle memory taking over where emotion didn't belong. Then I turned and walked out. The hallway felt longer than it usually did. Not because anything had changed, but because I was suddenly aware of every step, every sound, every pair of eyes that didn't quite look at me but definitely noticed. I didn't go back to my office. I went straight to my unit. My executive officer was already standing when I entered the command suite. He'd heard. "Word travels fast when something goes wrong." "Ma'am," he said carefully. I nodded. "You have command, effective immediately." He didn't argue. He didn't celebrate. He didn't ask questions he didn't want answers to. We walked through the handover the way professionals do, one item at a time. Key access, ongoing taskings, current issues that didn't care who wore the patch as long as someone was paying attention. I handed over the unit guide and myself. Not because it was required, but because it mattered. The senior enlisted advisor stood nearby, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't say anything until it was done. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "this doesn't make sense." "I know," I said. He watched me for a second longer, then nodded once and stepped back. I cleared my desk in 10 minutes. There wasn't much to take. A notebook, a challenge coin, a framed photo I kept turned face down most days anyway. I left everything else exactly where it was. I didn't want anyone later saying I'd taken something that wasn't mine. Before I left, I stopped by the operations board and updated one last status marker. It was a habit. Old ones don't die easily. Outside, the parking lot was full. Midday. Business as usual. People walked past me without stopping. A few nodded. A few looked away. Nobody asked what happened. That's how it works. If you want to stay invisible, you don't touch someone else's problem. I drove home without turning on the radio. The house was quiet when I got there. I set my keys down in the same spot I always did, and stood in the kitchen for a moment staring at nothing in particular. The silence wasn't heavy. It was just there. Removed from command, for attitude issues. I didn't replay the meeting. I didn't rehearse arguments I hadn't made. There was no point. What had happened was already documented, signed, and transmitted through channels that didn't care how I felt about it. I poured a glass of water and drank it standing up. Then I opened my laptop. Not to write an email, not to complain, not to vent. I logged into the secure portal and pulled up my personnel file. Everything was exactly where it should be. My evaluations, clean, my appointment orders. Still active, just superseded. No counseling statements, no adverse actions, no paper trail that matched the words attitude issues. I closed the file and shut the laptop. By the time the sun went down, my phone still hadn't rung. That wasn't unusual. These things take time. Offices close, people go home, decisions move slower than rumors. I made dinner, ate it, cleaned up. Later, I set my phone on the nightstand screen, up volume on. Not because I expected anything, but because when it did come, I didn't want to miss it. The house stayed quiet. Somewhere across base forms were being filed notifications, pushed systems updated by people who hadn't been in that room and didn't know the difference between a personal decision and a procedural one. The kind of people who trusted that what landed on their desk had already been done right. I turned off the light and lay back, eyes open, listening to the familiar sounds of a place that still felt like home. Nothing felt finished. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the moment after a door closes when the building is still standing, the lights are still on, and someone somewhere has just started reading more carefully than they expected to. The cursor blinked once on the screen before I closed the laptop and pushed it aside. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched a convoy roll past the house at a speed that suggested nothing was wrong anywhere. The base ran the same whether you were in charge or not. That was the point of systems. They didn't need you to feel important. I hadn't always worn command easily. That was something people assumed after the fact, like confidence was issued with rank. It wasn't. I earned it the slow way through time mistakes and a reputation for not breaking things that didn't need to be broken. I came in straight out of ROTC with good scores and a bad habit of asking why. Not in meetings, not in front of people who didn't need to hear it. I asked why in after-action reviews and planning sessions in quiet corners where answers mattered. Some leaders appreciated it. Others tolerated it as long as results followed. Results usually did. My first deployment taught me the difference between authority and control. Authority came with rank. Control came from competence. You could fake one. You couldn't fake the other for long. I watched lieutenants with louder voices lose their teams in weeks, and staff officers with perfect slides get ignored when things got messy. I learned to listen before I spoke, to be clear without being dramatic, to give orders that made sense to the people expected to carry them out. That approach didn't make you popular with everyone, but it made units function. By the time I made captain, my evaluations reflected that. Consistent language, steady under pressure, trusted by subordinates, exercises good judgment, not flashy, not political, just effective. When I was selected for command, it wasn't because I had asked for it. I hadn't. The slot opened unexpectedly, and the battalion needed someone who could stabilize a unit that had gone through too many leaders too quickly. I had the time and grade the evaluations and a reputation for not panicking when plans went sideways. The appointment order came through on a Tuesday. No ceremony, no applause, just another document in a system built on paper. I took command the following week. The unit wasn't broken. It was tired. Training schedules were packed tight. Equipment accountability was fine on paper, but loose in practice. Small things were slipping because nobody felt responsible for the whole picture. I fixed the small things first. Morning syncs that actually stayed on time. Maintenance deadlines that meant something. Clear priorities that didn't change every time someone higher up got nervous. I didn't try to reinvent anything. I just stopped letting noise drown out what mattered. The senior NCOs noticed. They always do. They don't care about speeches. They care about whether you make their jobs harder for no reason. Within a month, the unit settled. Not perfect. Just predictable in the ways that count. That was when the comments started. Not official ones. Side remarks. You're very direct. You push back more than most. You don't always sound flexible. I heard them and filed them where they belonged. Nobody sat me down. Nobody documented anything. There were no counseling statements, no warnings, no guidance to adjust anything. If there had been, I would have adjusted. That's how the system is supposed to work. Instead, I kept doing the job. My OER at the end of that cycle reflected it. Strong marks, clear language, nothing that hinted at a problem, let alone one serious enough to remove someone from command. That wasn't luck. That was alignment between what I did and what the army said it wanted leaders to do. Being a woman in command didn't help or hurt the way people think it does. Most days, it just existed. Some people were more careful around me. Some tested boundaries early. Both groups usually figured out where the line was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I didn't make examples out of people unless they forced my hand. Discipline was consistent, documented, and boring. Exactly how it should be. The only real tension came from above. Staff-level guidance started getting more specific in strange ways. Suggestions that felt less like recommendations and more like corrections. Questions about tone instead of outcomes. About how things looked instead of how they worked. None of it was formal. None of it came with paper. That was the part that stood out. When performance is the problem, paperwork follows. When attitude is the problem, people talk around it and hope you fix yourself without forcing them to explain what they mean. I didn't fix myself. Not because I was stubborn, but because no one could tell me what needed fixing. Every metric that mattered was solid. Training readiness was up. Retention was steady. Incident reports were down. My inbox was quiet in the ways leaders dream about. From where I stood, the job was working. From somewhere else, it apparently wasn't. I knew better than to pretend I didn't understand the politics of it. Command isn't just about the unit. It's about how the unit reflects on the people above you. It's about trust alignment and sometimes optics that don't translate cleanly into regulations. I just didn't think it would come to this. Not without warning, not without process. I finished my water and set the glass down, then checked my phone again. Still nothing, no messages, no missed calls, just the date and time staring back at me like it always had. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was something closer to clarity. You don't make it this far without learning to recognize patterns. You learn what problems announce themselves and which ones arrive quietly, fully formed, and already decided. This hadn't come out of nowhere. It had come from a place that preferred compliance over effectiveness and silence over questions. A place where being right wasn't as important as being easy to manage. I leaned back against the counter and thought about the appointment order again. Not the headline, the details, the language most people skimmed past because it never mattered until it did. Somewhere between how I had been selected and how I had been removed, the system had been asked to accept a version of events that didn't match its own records. That mismatch didn't disappear just because someone outranked me. I picked up my phone and set it back down, screen still up. There was nothing to do right now. No emails to send, no calls to make, no arguments to win, just a unit that kept moving, a command I no longer held, and a file somewhere that looked cleaner than the decision attached to it. If this was about attitude, the paperwork would eventually have to agree. And paperwork, unlike people, doesn't care who your sister is. I shut the fridge a little harder than I needed to and felt the vibration run through the kitchen floor. Not anger. Recognition. The kind that shows up when you finally stop pretending a pattern is random. Rebecca and I didn't just share a last name. We shared a childhood built around rank rules and the quiet understanding that everything was earned except expectations. Our father wore his uniform. The way some people wear skin, always present, never discussed. Our mother ran the house like a command post. Schedules, pinned standards, enforced excuses, denied. Rebecca was the firstborn, which mattered more in our house than anyone admitted. She learned early how to perform confidence, how to speak cleanly, how to stay inside the lines while still getting ahead. Teachers liked her, coaches trusted her. Authority responded to her the way it responds to people who never make it uncomfortable. I followed a few years later and learned different lessons. I watched Rebecca succeed by anticipating what people wanted and giving it to them. I learned to succeed by figuring out what actually needed to happen and making it happen whether it impressed anyone or not. Neither approach was wrong. They just led to different rooms. When Rebecca chose the military, it surprised no one. She was built for structure. She understood hierarchy instinctively. She didn't question orders unless she was sure the answer wouldn't embarrass anyone. When I followed her in, people treated it like a continuation instead of a choice. As if there was only one path available to girls raised the way we were. Rebecca didn't discourage it. She just assumed she'd always be ahead. And for a long time, she was. She moved quickly through staff roles, picked up mentors who valued polish and predictability, and learned how to navigate meetings where nothing was written down but everything was remembered. She understood that perception was currency, and that control didn't always come from being right. I moved differently. Operational assignments, harder jobs, less visible wins, the kind that mattered to the people doing the work, but didn't always translate cleanly up the chain. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. Family gatherings were polite, careful. We didn't argue. We didn't compare. We also didn't pretend not to notice when conversations shifted toward Rebecca's latest position or when people assumed I was supporting her just by existing in the same organization. By the time she pinned Colonel, the gap between us wasn't just rank. It was worldview. Rebecca believed systems worked best when they were protected from friction. I believed systems only worked when friction was addressed instead of buried. She trusted alignment. I trusted process. Those differences stayed theoretical until they didn't. When I took command, I didn't announce it to family. Rebecca heard about it through channels long before I could have told her myself. She congratulated me with a text that read like something she'd approved for release. "Proud of you, big responsibility, make us look good." I didn't respond. From that point on, her presence in my professional life increased without ever becoming obvious. Questions filtered down from staff that carried her phrasing, guidance that mirrored her priorities, requests framed as suggestions that didn't leave much room to decline. None of it crossed a line. Not on paper, but it changed the air. She didn't like how directly I spoke in meetings. She didn't like that my unit didn't sugarcoat reports. She didn't like that my after-action reviews focused on decisions instead of messaging. None of those things were violations. They were just inconvenient. Once after a briefing, she pulled me aside. "You need to soften your approach," she said, voice low, smile fixed. "People don't always respond well to being corrected." I told her I wasn't correcting people. I was clarifying outcomes. She sighed the way older siblings do when they think you're missing something obvious. "It's not about outcomes. It's about trust." I looked at her and realized we were using the same word to mean completely different things. To her, trust meant predictability. To me, it meant honesty. That conversation didn't go anywhere. It wasn't supposed to. It was a warning dressed as advice. After that, I noticed how often she spoke about unity, about cohesion, about how important it was for leaders to present a consistent front. Words that sound harmless until you realize they're being used to discourage disagreement. Rebecca didn't need to micromanage me. She just needed to shape the environment around me so that any friction I caused looked like a personal failing instead of a structural one. When she talked about attitude, she wasn't talking about behavior. She was talking about compliance. That distinction mattered. I wasn't disrespectful. I wasn't insubordinate. I didn't undermine authority. I followed orders. I just didn't perform deference the way she expected it to look. That difference didn't matter when she was several levels removed from my daily work. It mattered a lot when she had direct influence over decisions that affected my position. The day she called me in, there was no personal preamble, no acknowledgement of family, no attempt to separate roles. She didn't have to. The system did that for her. She used the same tone she used with everyone else. Calm, measured, reasonable. That was the part that hurt the least. Rebecca didn't remove me from command because she hated me. She did it because in her calculus, I had become a liability. Not because I was failing, but because I wasn't easy to manage. From her perspective, it was clean, efficient, necessary. From mine, it was familiar. I'd seen leaders like her before, smart, controlled, convincing, people who believed deeply in the organization and just as deeply in their ability to decide what was best for it. They rarely thought of themselves as wrong. They thought of themselves as responsible. Standing in my kitchen, replaying the shape of the last few months, I didn't feel betrayed. Betrayal implies surprise. This felt more like confirmation. Family complicates things because it teaches you early how to read between lines, how to hear what isn't being said, how to recognize when a decision has been made long before the conversation that announces it. Rebecca hadn't acted impulsively. She'd acted decisively within a system she understood very well. The problem wasn't that she'd overstepped. The problem was that she assumed no one would notice. I picked up my phone again, more out of habit than expectation, and checked the time. Still quiet, still nothing. Somewhere Rebecca was probably convinced this would settle quickly, that I'd take the reassignment, smooth things over, and let the moment pass without leaving a mark. That was the version of me she remembered. She hadn't noticed how much I'd learned by watching her move through the same system she now trusted to protect her. The fridge hummed behind me, steady and indifferent. I set the phone down and went back to the window. Outside, the base lights came on one by one, exactly on schedule. Whatever this was going to become, it wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be procedural. The first thing I did the next morning was put on running shoes and step outside before the base fully woke up. The air was cool, the kind that makes your lungs work without asking permission. I ran the same route I always did, past the same buildings, past the same flags being raised with mechanical precision. Nothing about my surroundings reflected what had happened the day before. That was comforting in a way that didn't feel sentimental. By the time I got back, my phone had a single new notification. Not a call, not a message. An automated update confirming my access permissions had been modified. Neutral language, efficient, no explanation attached. I showered, dressed, and sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop open. Not to write anything, to read. If attitude was the problem, there should have been evidence. That's how the system works when it's functioning correctly. Leaders don't just decide someone's tone is unacceptable and move on. They document, they counsel, they give an officer a chance to correct whatever needs correcting. I opened my file again and scrolled slowly. Counseling statements, none. Letters of concern, none. Performance improvement plans, none. There was nothing new since my last evaluation cycle. No late additions, no quiet notes slipped in after hours. Just the same clean record it had been before the briefing room. I checked my officer evaluation reports one by one. Each one told the same story in slightly different words. Direct communicator, results focused, maintains standards. Nothing that could reasonably be twisted into a justification for removal. I didn't feel relief, I felt confirmation. Downrange, when something goes wrong, you learn quickly that the absence of information can be more telling than its presence. If there's no record of a problem, it usually means someone didn't want to explain it. I thought about the last 6 months, every meeting, every interaction with staff, every time someone above me had raised an eyebrow or made a comment that didn't quite land as guidance. You come across very firm. You might want to consider how that sounds. You don't leave a lot of room for interpretation. All spoken, none written. That wasn't accidental. It was a way of creating a narrative without committing to it. A way of laying the groundwork without putting fingerprints on the paper. I closed the laptop and drove back onto base. The administrative building was already busy. People moved through the hallways with coffee in hand, conversations half started and half finished. I passed a few familiar faces. Most nodded. A couple paused like they wanted to say something and then thought better of it. At the end of the hallway, I ran into my former executive officer. He looked uncomfortable, which told me more than words would have. "Ma'am," he said. "Captain," I corrected gently. He nodded. "Right, sorry." We stood there for a moment, neither of us blocking the hallway, but neither of us moving either. "They didn't give me anything," he said finally. "No guidance, no explanation, just the order," I figured I said. He hesitated. For what it's worth, nobody was expecting this. Not like this. I believed him. That was the part that bothered me most. When decisions are justified, they come with preparation, briefings, talking points. A trail of conversations designed to make the outcome feel inevitable. This hadn't had any of that. It felt rushed. Or worse, assumed. I continued down the hall and stopped by the senior enlisted advisor's office. He was inside, door open, already mid-conversation with someone else. He caught my eye and gave a small nod that said he'd be with me in a minute. When he did, he didn't invite me to sit. "They're calling it attitude," he said quietly. "Not asking anything." "Yes." He exhaled through his nose. "That's thin, that's generous." He crossed his arms. "No counseling, no paper, no pattern, correct." He looked down the hallway before speaking again. "That's not how it's supposed to go." No, he didn't offer advice. He didn't need to. His tone carried something closer to concern than sympathy. "People will notice," he said. I nodded. "They already have." That was the problem with vague justifications. They don't just affect the person they're aimed at. They create uncertainty for everyone watching. If attitude can mean anything, it can mean anyone. I left his office and walked back outside. On the way to my car, I passed a group of junior officers talking in low voices. One of them stopped when he saw me and straightened up, unsure whether to salute. I gave him a small nod and kept walking. The system depends on predictability. People need to believe that if they do the job, follow the rules, and document their work, outcomes will make sense even when they're uncomfortable. When that belief cracks, it doesn't break loudly, it erodes. I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, hands on the steering wheel, eyes on the building I'd just left. Rebecca hadn't accused me of misconduct. She hadn't cited a failure. She'd used a word that couldn't be disproven easily, because it hadn't been defined at all. That choice wasn't careless, it was strategic. Attitude doesn't require evidence. It doesn't trigger automatic safeguards. It doesn't demand immediate explanation. It sounds reasonable to people who don't look too closely, unless they do. Back at home, I pulled the appointment order back up on my laptop. Not the summary page, the full document, every paragraph, every reference. The kind of reading most people skip because it rarely matters. The language around removal was clear. Conditions, procedures, requirements. Not dramatic, just specific. I didn't highlight anything. I didn't annotate. I didn't take notes. I just read until the words stopped being abstract and started aligning with the reality I was living. When an officer is removed for cause, documentation follows. When an officer is removed without cause, other mechanisms exist to protect the integrity of the process. That distinction mattered more than Rebecca probably realized. I closed the document and leaned back in the chair. Somewhere in the administrative pipeline, a decision had already been transmitted as complete. Done, clean, closed. What no one had bothered to check was whether the justification matched the standard the system itself required. Attitude might have been enough to move me out of a chair. It wasn't enough to reconcile the record. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and headed back out. There were still places on base, where forms went through hands instead of screens, where people processed paperwork by routine rather than by curiosity. Those routines worked as long as nobody asked them to do more than they were designed to do. Today they were being asked exactly that. And no one had told them why. I took the long way across base, the route that cut behind motor pool offices, and ended near the administrative annex. Most people only visited when something had gone wrong. The place ran on habit. Forms in, forms out. Stamps applied by people who trusted that what landed on their desk had already survived scrutiny somewhere else. That trust was the real system. Paper just moved it along. I hadn't started preparing because I thought my sister would remove me from command. I'd started preparing because I'd learned over years of watching good officers get sidelined that preparation wasn't paranoia. It was hygiene. Early in my career, a major I respected had been reassigned with almost no explanation. No misconduct, no failure, just a quiet shift justified by fit. He left with his reputation intact, but his trajectory changed permanently. Months later, someone admitted off the record that the paperwork hadn't supported the decision. By then, it didn't matter. That lesson stuck. From that point on, I kept copies of everything that mattered. Not to build a case, to preserve context, orders, evaluations, emails that confirmed intent. I didn't hoard, I curated. If it didn't tie directly to authority, responsibility, or accountability, it didn't stay. When I took command, I doubled down. Command appointments aren't casual assignments. They come with language that most people skim because it's boilerplate until it isn't. Terms about removal, authority, review. What happens when a decision is questioned without being challenged? I read all of it, not once. Every time something felt off. The signs weren't dramatic, no blow-ups, no confrontations. Just a gradual shift in tone, more guidance that arrived verbally instead of in writing. More suggestions that carried an edge. Fewer follow-ups when I asked for clarification. When leaders want flexibility, they document. When they want deniability, they don't, so I adjusted, quietly. I stopped acknowledging verbal direction without confirming it later through official channels. I made sure meeting summaries reflected actual decisions, not softened versions. I saved calendar invites that showed who was present when guidance was given. None of this slowed my work. It just made my footprint clearer. People assume preparation looks like plotting. It doesn't. Most of the time, it looks like consistency, doing the same boring things the same way every day, so that if someone ever questions what happened, the answer is already there. I didn't talk about it with anyone. Not my executive officer, not my senior enlisted advisor, not Rebecca. Especially not Rebecca. Family complicates preparation because it makes you second-guess instincts you'd trust without hesitation if the person across from you shared only a rank, not a childhood. I wanted to believe that whatever disagreements we had professionally would stay contained. That she would respect process, even if she didn't like my style. That being her sister would protect me from shortcuts, not make them easier. That belief eroded slowly, not in one moment. The first time she bypassed my chain and asked one of my staff for information directly, I noted it and moved on. The second time I documented it. The third time I made sure the response went back through me before it went anywhere else. She didn't comment. She didn't need to. The message had already been sent. By the time she started framing concerns as attitude, I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed, but disappointment doesn't change outcomes. Preparation sometimes does. That afternoon after leaving the annex, I stopped by a small office tucked behind supply. A civilian clerk I'd worked with for years sat behind the counter, glasses perched low, moving paper from one tray to another with practiced efficiency. She looked up when I walked in. "Captain," I nodded. "Ma'am," she smiled faintly. "They already updated your status, I saw." She tapped the stack of forms beside her. "Orders came through clean, no notes." "Of course they did." She paused, then lowered her voice. "You know those go through review, right?" "I do." "Sometimes they bounce," she said. "Not often, but it happens. I know." She studied me for a moment, then nodded and went back to her work. No questions, no commentary, just an acknowledgement that systems don't always move in straight lines. I walked out feeling lighter than I had all day, not because anything had changed, but because nothing had been missed. Back at home, I laid everything out on the table, not dramatically, just methodically, orders in one pile, evaluations in another, emails sorted by date. I didn't create a narrative, I let the record speak for itself. There were no gaps, no sudden shifts, no indication that anything had gone wrong until the moment it had been declared wrong. That mattered. Preparation isn't about controlling the outcome. It's about removing excuses, about making it impossible for someone to say they didn't know or didn't see what was right in front of them. I wasn't planning to challenge the decision. I wasn't drafting a complaint. I wasn't escalating anything. I was just ensuring that when the system did what it was designed to do, check its own work, it had the full picture. People misunderstand restraint. They think silence means acceptance. In reality, silence is often just timing. I put the folders back where they belonged and cleaned the table. Dinner came and went without much thought. My phone stayed quiet. Late that evening, I stepped outside again. The base had settled into its night rhythm. Fewer cars, dimmer lights, the kind of calm that makes everything feel stable even when it isn't. Somewhere the paperwork I'd signed was moving, through hands, through inboxes, through processes that assumed accuracy, because accuracy was supposed to be baked in. What I'd learned over the years was that systems don't fail because people are malicious. They fail because people stop checking once they're comfortable. Rebecca was comfortable. She believed the decision would land, be processed, and disappear into the administrative background where uncomfortable things went to be forgotten. What she hadn't accounted for was the difference between removing someone from a position and reconciling that removal with the record that justified it. That reconciliation wasn't optional. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. And procedures don't care about intent. They care about alignment. I went back inside and set my phone on the counter, volume on. Not because I expected a call that night, but because preparation doesn't end when the action does. It ends when the system finishes asking questions. Somewhere in that system, a form would reach a desk where someone's job was to make sure the boxes actually matched what was inside them. When that happened, the work I'd done quietly over years would start doing its own. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change the direction of a conversation that hadn't expected to happen at all. The administrative annex was quieter in the late afternoon, the kind of quiet that comes from people finishing tasks instead of starting them. I sat at the small desk in the corner, laptop, open folders, aligned the way I liked them. Not because alignment mattered, but because it kept my hands busy while my head stayed clear. I wasn't looking for a loophole. Loopholes imply trickery. What I was looking for was consistency. Command appointment orders follow a template. Everyone knows that. Most officers skim the top half, confirm dates and authority, then move on. The lower sections are where the language gets technical and the interest drops. That's where the rules live. I scrolled past the header and read slowly. Authority to assume command. Conditions of appointment. Duration, removal, there it was. The sentence wasn't dramatic. It didn't threaten anyone. It didn't promise consequences. It simply described what had to happen if certain conditions were met. When an officer is relieved of command without documented cause, consistent with regulatory standards, the action requires formal review to ensure compliance with administrative law and command policy. That was it. No fireworks, no hidden trap, just a requirement. People misunderstand how these things work. They imagine a single sentence detonating like a bomb. In reality, it's more like a switch that turns on a light in a room everyone assumed would stay dark. I read it again, then followed the reference to the regulation it pointed to. Same language, same expectation. Documentation isn't optional. Review isn't discretionary, it's automatic. I closed the document and leaned back. Rebecca hadn't violated a rule by removing me from command. Commanders have authority to do that. The problem wasn't the action, it was the explanation attached to it. Attitude issues isn't a documented cause, it's an opinion. Opinions don't satisfy regulatory standards. They trigger scrutiny. That's what most people forget. Authority allows you to act. It doesn't allow you to skip reconciliation with the system that tracks those actions. I hadn't filed anything. I hadn't requested anything. All I'd done was sign the order acknowledging receipt, the same thing officers do every day without thinking twice. That acknowledgement was enough to move the paperwork into the next phase of processing. From there, it wasn't mine anymore. The system did what it was designed to do when inputs didn't match expectations. It flagged the discrepancy, not loudly, not publicly, just enough to route it to people whose job it was to ask questions no one else wanted to ask. I packed up my folders and left the annex. Outside, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I paused for a moment, watching people load bags into trunks, conversations ending as they turned toward home. Nobody looked at me. Nobody needed to. Back at the house, I set my laptop on the kitchen counter and poured another glass of water. I didn't feel triumphant. That would have been premature. What I felt was steadiness. This wasn't about proving Rebecca wrong. It wasn't about embarrassing her. It wasn't even about getting my command back. It was about alignment. Decisions in the military don't exist in isolation. They sit inside a structure built to survive bad actors and bad judgment alike. When something doesn't line up, the structure doesn't collapse. It adjusts. That adjustment starts quietly. I checked my phone. No calls, no messages. Still nothing. That was expected. Reviews don't announce themselves. They gather context first. They pull files. They compare dates. They look for patterns that don't require opinions to be understood. Somewhere, someone was opening my personnel record next to the removal order and noticing that the narrative didn't match the data. That observation didn't accuse anyone. It didn't take sides. It just existed. I made dinner and ate standing up, then rinsed the plate and set it in the rack. The routine helped. Familiar actions in a day that had already proven it wasn't going to follow familiar rules. Later, I sat on the couch with my laptop open again, not because I needed to look at anything, but because I wanted to be ready if something changed. I kept the volume up, screen visible. Rebecca didn't call. That wasn't surprising either. From her perspective, the issue was resolved. Command reassigned, authority exercised. The system would catch up eventually the way it always did. She was counting on momentum, on the assumption that by the time anyone questioned the justification, the decision would already be normalized. Momentum is powerful. It's also fragile when it's built on incomplete information. I thought about the number of times I'd watched similar decisions pass unexamined because no one wanted to be the person who slowed things down. Because challenging authority feels like friction, and friction feels like risk. What people forget is that the system is designed to absorb friction. That's what keeps it from breaking. The phone buzzed once on the counter. I looked at it, not rushing. An email notification. Automated. Subject line short and neutral. Administrative review initiated. No explanation, no instructions, just a confirmation that something had moved from assumed to examined. I didn't open it right away. I didn't need to. The words told me enough. This wasn't escalation, it was process. Rebecca would find out soon enough, not from me, from the same channels she trusted to handle everything else. I closed the laptop and set it aside. Somewhere in an office with no windows and no personal stakes, someone was doing exactly what their job required. Comparing language, checking boxes, verifying that the reason given met the standard required. They weren't thinking about family, they weren't thinking about rank. They weren't thinking about me. They were thinking about whether the paperwork made sense. That was the part Rebecca had overlooked. Not because she didn't know the rule existed, but because she assumed it wouldn't matter. Most of the time it doesn't, but when it does, it doesn't need anyone to raise their voice or file a complaint. It just needs someone to have signed the right document and let it move forward as designed. I stood up and turned off the kitchen light. Whatever questions were forming weren't mine to answer yet. I hadn't asked them. I hadn't pushed for them. I just made sure the system had to ask them itself. And once it started, it wouldn't stop just because the outcome was inconvenient. The phone vibrated against the counter instead of ringing a setting I'd forgotten I'd changed months ago after too many early morning alerts. I glanced at the screen without picking it up. Unknown number, area code from base. I let it vibrate twice before answering. Captain Carter, a male voice said, careful and neutral. This is Major Lewis from the legal office. Yes, I said. There was a pause, the kind people use when they're deciding how much context to provide before they ask the question they already know they have to ask. I'm calling regarding the administrative review initiated earlier today, he said. I just need to confirm a few details. Go ahead. Another pause, papers shifting, a keyboard tap, then silence again. Did you submit any additional statements or requests after receiving the removal order? No. Any correspondence to the Inspector General? No. Any formal challenge to the decision? No. That seemed to unsettle him more than if I'd answered differently. All right, he said slowly. Just so I'm clear, the only action you took was acknowledging receipt of the command removal order. That's correct. He inhaled, then exhaled as if resetting his approach. Captain, I need to ask you something directly, he said. Were you aware that acknowledging the order would initiate a regulatory review under the appointment authority? Yes. He stopped typing. I see, he said after a beat that lasted just long enough to matter. And you understood that review would assess whether the stated justification met administrative standards? Yes. Silence settled in heavier this time. Major Lewis didn't sound angry. He didn't sound accusatory. What he sounded was careful. Like someone who had just realized the ground under a routine call wasn't as solid as expected. Captain, he said, the stated reason for your removal is listed as attitude issues. Can you point me to any documented counseling warnings or adverse evaluations associated with that concern? No. Have you ever received verbal counseling that was subsequently documented? No. Were you ever instructed to modify your communication style in writing? No. The keyboard came back to life on his end faster now. Captain, he said again, and this time the word carried weight. Are you related to the officer who signed the removal order? Yes. Another pause. This one longer. Colonel Rebecca Carter is your sister. He said, not as a question. That's correct. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had shifted from neutral to procedural. Thank you for confirming, he said. I need to make you aware that this information affects how the review proceeds. I understand. Specifically, he continued, the presence of a direct family relationship between the deciding authority and the affected officer requires additional scrutiny to rule out unlawful command influence. I understand. He cleared his throat. Captain, I want to be clear, he said. This review was not initiated because of any action you took beyond acknowledging the order. It was flagged automatically based on regulatory criteria. That's what I expected. Yes, he said. And there it was, the slightest crack. I'm sure it was. He stopped again, then spoke more quietly. There are some discrepancies we need to resolve, he said. Primarily the lack of supporting documentation for the stated cause. I don't have anything to add. I'm not asking you to, he said quickly. At this point, the record will speak for itself. That sentence landed differently than the rest. Major Lewis wasn't trying to extract anything from me. He wasn't looking for leverage. He was managing a situation that had outgrown the assumptions attached to it. Captain, he said, you may be contacted again as part of the review. For now, there is no action required on your part. Understood. Please do not discuss this matter with anyone involved in the decision-making process, he added. I wasn't planning to. Another pause, shorter this time. Thank you for your time, he said. Good night. Good night. The call ended. I set the phone down and leaned against the counter, not because I needed support, but because the kitchen had become very quiet all at once. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space where the conversation had been. That was it. No accusations, no drama, just confirmation that the system had noticed what it was supposed to notice. The call hadn't been confrontational. It hadn't been sympathetic. It had been surgical. Major Lewis hadn't asked how I felt. He hadn't asked what I wanted. He hadn't even hinted at an outcome. He'd focused on one thing, whether the paperwork matched the standard. It didn't. I poured another glass of water and took a slow sip, letting the moment settle without assigning it more meaning than it deserved. This wasn't a win. Not yet. It was a shift. Rebecca would have received notification by now, not a phone call like mine, an email, a calendar hold, a request for records, something impersonal and immediate. From her side, it would feel sudden. From mine, it felt overdue. I didn't imagine her panicking. Rebecca didn't panic. She recalculated. She would review what she'd submitted, realize what wasn't there, and assume it could be smoothed over with the right explanation. Explanations work when there's something to explain. The problem with attitude issues is that they dissolve under scrutiny. You can't reconstruct them retroactively without exposing the fact that they were never solid to begin with. I picked up my phone again and checked for messages. Still nothing from her. That wasn't a sign of restraint. It was a sign of control. Rebecca wouldn't reach out until she knew what she was dealing with. She wouldn't admit uncertainty until she'd exhausted every other option. The legal office wouldn't move quickly. They didn't need to. Time was on their side, not hers. What I found myself thinking about wasn't the review itself, but how many times I'd watched similar situations resolve quietly, because the affected officer tried to explain themselves instead of letting the record stand. Explanations invite interpretation. Records don't. I hadn't said anything to incriminate anyone. I hadn't said anything to defend myself. I'd answered questions and stopped. That restraint wasn't strategic. It was habitual. Years of command teach you that speaking less doesn't mean knowing less. It often means the opposite. The house settled around me again, familiar and unchanged. Somewhere across base, someone was opening folders, reading evaluations, checking dates. Not because I'd asked them to, because the system had asked them to. And the system, once engaged, doesn't care about intentions. It cares about compliance. I turned off the kitchen light and headed toward the bedroom phone, still in hand, volume still up. The night wasn't heavy, it was active. Quietly, methodically active. And whatever recalculations were happening on the other end of that call, they were no longer hypothetical. They were procedural. I woke before the alarm and lay there for a moment, listening to the house settle the way it always did just before morning. Nothing felt different, but the air carried that faint sense of adjustment, like something had shifted overnight and hadn't decided yet how obvious it wanted to be. By the time I poured coffee, my phone buzzed. Not a call. A calendar notification I hadn't created. Mandatory availability window. No details. Just a time block marked by the legal office. I didn't acknowledge it. There was nothing to acknowledge. The meeting existed whether I clicked yes or not. I drove onto base, later than usual, parked farther from the administrative buildings than I used to, and walked the rest of the way. That walk gave me time to notice the small changes. Doors that were usually open now, half closed. Conversations that paused when I passed. Nothing dramatic. Just awareness spreading outward in quiet rings. The legal office occupied a narrow strip of the headquarters building, tucked between operations and personnel. Neutral territory by design. No windows, no flags. Just desks, file cabinets, and people whose job was to care more about process than preference. I signed in and took a seat where I was told. A captain I didn't recognize offered me water. I declined. He nodded, checked a box, and disappeared down the hallway without making conversation. Minutes passed. Then more. When Major Lewis appeared, he didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He carried a folder that was thicker than the one from the briefing room and set it down between us like a divider. "Captain Carter," he said. "Thank you for coming." I nodded. "We're conducting a procedural review," he continued. "This is not an investigation, it's a verification. I understand." He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. "Not the removal order, something older. Is this your command appointment order?" he asked. "Yes." "Is this a complete copy?" he asked. "It is." He marked something on his notepad. "We've compared this with the removal order," he said. "The stated cause does not align with the requirements outlined here." He said it plainly, no emphasis, no judgment, just a fact. "Have you ever been counseled for attitude-related concerns in a way that was documented and acknowledged?" he asked. "No." "Has anyone provided written guidance instructing you to modify your leadership approach?" he asked. "No." "Has any adverse action been initiated against you prior to the removal?" he asked. "No." He looked up, then briefly meeting my eyes for the first time. "All right," he said. He closed the folder and leaned back slightly. "Because of the family relationship involved," he said, "we're expanding the scope of the review to ensure there was no undue influence in the decision-making process." "I understand." That phrase kept coming up. It didn't mean I agreed with anything. It meant I knew how this worked. During this review, he said, "You are not to communicate with the officer who issued the removal order regarding this matter." I wasn't planning to. He nodded, made another note, and stood. "That will be all for now," he said. I left the office and stepped back into the hallway, which felt louder than it had when I arrived. Phones rang, printers hummed. People moved with purpose that wasn't directed at me, but now intersected with my path anyway. Halfway down the corridor, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message. "Rebecca, can we talk?" I didn't stop walking. I didn't answer immediately either. I waited until I was outside the doors, closing behind me with a muted thud before I typed a response. "I've been advised not to discuss this." It wasn't cold, it wasn't accusatory, it was accurate. The reply came almost instantly. "This doesn't need to be a legal issue, we can resolve it internally." That was Rebecca speaking the language she trusted most. Control, containment, damage limitation. I didn't respond. I drove home and parked in the driveway, engine still running for a moment longer than necessary. I could picture her side of this clearly. A decision made for reasons she considered valid, suddenly reframed as a risk she hadn't planned for. Not because she'd violated a rule outright, but because she'd assumed her authority would carry the rest. It often does. Just not when documentation is thin and relationships are close enough to require extra scrutiny. The next message came 10 minutes later. I didn't intend for this to escalate. That one made me pause. Intent is a word people reach for when outcomes stop cooperating. It sounds reasonable. It sounds explanatory. It doesn't fix records. I turned off the engine and went inside. By early afternoon, the base rumor mill was in motion. Nothing specific, just questions. Why legal was involved. Why a routine command change was suddenly under review. Why certain meetings were being rescheduled without explanation. I received another automated message confirming my availability window had been extended. Still no details. That told me everything I needed to know. The review wasn't staying narrow. Later, my former executive officer called. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. They're asking for everything, he said. Emails, meeting notes, anything related to guidance. That makes sense, I said. He hesitated. They're being very specific. About what? About who said what he said, and when. I closed my eyes briefly and nodded, even though he couldn't see it. That's how they do it, I said. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and watched the light shift across the floor. I wasn't worried. I wasn't relieved either. What I felt was distance. This had stopped being about me. Once legal gets involved at this level, individual narratives lose value. What matters is sequence, authority, documentation, alignment between action and regulation. Rebecca would be working through that reality now, likely surrounded by people who had assured her everything was fine until it clearly wasn't. She would be asking how this had happened. Who had let it get this far? Why no one had flagged the issue earlier? The answer wouldn't be satisfying. No one had failed to catch a trick. No one had missed a loophole. The system had simply done what it was built to do once it was given enough information to see the mismatch. I checked my phone again. No new messages. That silence wasn't peace. It was recalibration. When family drama stays private, it's emotional. When it enters the legal channel, it becomes structural. The language changes. The stakes shift. Control moves away from individuals and into process. Rebecca knew that. She'd built her career on understanding it. What she hadn't accounted for was how unforgiving that process could be when it was forced to look directly at something it usually glanced past. I stood up, rinsed my mug, and set it in the rack. The day wasn't over. It wasn't resolved. It was simply moving forward under rules that didn't adjust themselves for comfort. Somewhere between the legal office and the command floor, a family disagreement had become a matter of compliance. And compliance doesn't negotiate. The review stopped being quiet the moment it touched more than one office. I noticed it in small ways first. A meeting room that was suddenly unavailable because legal needed it. A training brief pushed back with no explanation. A staff officer I'd known for years. asking carefully whether I'd already turned in everything I had. By midweek, it was clear the process had widened beyond my removal, and into the space leaders don't like to acknowledge exists the space where patterns live. I hadn't been contacted again by legal, but that didn't mean nothing was happening. It meant the opposite. When questions multiply, they stop coming to the same person. My former unit was asked to provide a complete timeline of guidance related to leadership style communication and command climate. Not just emails, meeting notes, slides. Anything that supported the idea that attitude issues had been a documented concern instead of a retrospective label. That kind of request doesn't target one decision. It tests whether similar language had been used before. When legal reviews go that direction, they're no longer verifying compliance. They're assessing risk. I ran into a lieutenant colonel I trusted outside the dining facility. He didn't ask how I was doing. He asked something more useful. "Did anyone ever put concerns about you in writing?" he said quietly. "No." He nodded once. "That's what we're seeing." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That was confirmation enough. The review wasn't just comparing my file to my removal order. It was comparing how leadership concerns were handled across the command. Who got counseled, who got documented, who got labeled. Patterns don't accuse people, they reveal habits. By the end of the week, Inspector General had been looped in not to investigate misconduct, but to observe. That's the stage before something becomes officially uncomfortable. IG doesn't ask questions first. They watch. They note how people respond to scrutiny, who gets defensive, who tries to reframe language, who suddenly remembers conversations that were never documented. Those reactions matter more than the answers. Rebecca hadn't reached out again. That silence told me she was no longer driving the response. When leadership stops communicating directly, it usually means they've been advised not to. The base didn't buzz. It murmured. Staff officers spoke in lower tones. Meetings ended early. People who usually filled silence with opinions let it sit instead. No one said my name out loud unless they had to. That was fine. The system works best when it's impersonal. I spent the time doing what I'd always done when things got complicated. I stayed available, answered questions when asked, and avoided offering explanations that hadn't been requested. The hardest part of that restraint wasn't patience. It was watching people try to help by saying too much. A junior officer stopped me outside personnel and said, "This is messed up." I thanked him and kept walking. Sympathy doesn't change records. It just creates noise. Later that day, I received a message from legal asking me to confirm receipt of a document. No comment, no questions, just a digital acknowledgement request tied to a packet I hadn't seen yet. When I opened it, I recognized the format immediately. Preliminary findings, not conclusions, not recommendations, findings. The language was careful, almost sterile. The removal order lacked sufficient documentation to support the stated cause. The presence of a direct family relationship required heightened scrutiny. The absence of written counseling or corrective guidance created a discrepancy between action and regulation. It didn't name Rebecca. It didn't need to. It did something more consequential. It placed the burden of explanation back on the decision makers. Once that happens, the question shifts from, was this allowed to, can this be defended? Defensibility is where a lot of authority quietly runs out. I acknowledged receipt and closed the document. That evening, I ran into the senior enlisted advisor again. He looked tired, not overwhelmed, just aware. "They're asking about other cases," he said. "Similar ones?" I asked. "Same language," he said. "Different people." That was the moment it stopped being about me. If my case had been an outlier, it would have been corrected quietly and moved on. But the review had found enough repetition to justify looking wider. Language like attitude issues shows up when leaders want flexibility without friction. It's vague by design. Useful until it isn't. When legal sees it repeated, they don't see discretion. They see a risk profile. By Friday, the scope of the review included multiple command actions across different units. Not because anyone had complained, but because the initial discrepancy made it impossible not to check. Rebecca's authority hadn't been challenged. Her judgment had. That distinction matters. Authority can withstand questions. Judgment has to earn its way back. I received a final message that night, short and formal. "Please remain available next week." No signature, no tone. I shut the phone off and set it down. At this point, the system was doing what it always does when it realizes it's been relying too heavily on assumptions. It slows down, it double-checks. It asks whether the shortcuts it's been taking were actually acceptable or just convenient. That process is uncomfortable for people who built careers on knowing how to move fast without leaving marks. Rebecca had always been good at moving cleanly. She understood what to say, what not to put in writing, and how to frame decisions so they landed without resistance. What she hadn't accounted for was how the absence of documentation could become its own kind of evidence when someone finally bothered to look. I didn't feel vindicated. That emotion belongs to outcomes. This was still movement. What I felt was something closer to inevitability. Once a system realizes it's been protecting decisions instead of standards, it doesn't correct gently, it corrects thoroughly, not to punish, to prevent recurrence. That kind of correction doesn't stop at the original trigger. It spreads outward until it's confident the behavior that caused the discrepancy can't repeat itself without being noticed again. I turned the phone back on and placed it face up on the nightstand. Whatever else happened, the direction had already changed, and no one had raised their voice to make it happen. The first official correction didn't come with an apology. It came as an update. I received it the same way I'd received everything else, through a secure notification with language so neutral it almost felt indifferent. The subject line didn't reference my removal, it referenced my record. Administrative amendment completed. I read it once, then again slower. The negative notation associated with the removal order had been rescinded. The justification field was blanked, replaced by a standard administrative reference, indicating the action had not met documentation requirements. No commentary, no narrative, just a correction that realigned the file with the facts it had always contained. That mattered more than any explanation. In the military, records are currency. Not reputation, not intention, records. They decide assignments, promotions, trust. When something is wrong, the damage doesn't come from gossip. It comes from a line of text that doesn't belong. That line was gone. Later that morning, legal called again. Not Major Lewis this time. A different officer, same tone, same restraint. "You've been cleared of any adverse administrative findings," he said. "Your record reflects no misconduct or performance deficiencies." "Understood. There will be a reassignment," he continued. "Equivalent in scope and responsibility to your previous command. When orders are pending final routing," he said, "you'll be notified." I thanked him and ended the call. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even sit down. I stood there in the kitchen, phone in hand, and waited for the rest of the information to settle. Justice in this system doesn't look like confrontation. It looks like alignment being restored quietly without spectacle. By the afternoon, word had reached people who didn't need details to understand what had happened. The senior enlisted advisor stopped by my house unannounced, something he'd never done before. "They fixed it," he said. "Yes." He nodded. "They fixed more than just yours." I believed him. When systems correct themselves, they don't do it in isolation. They look for consistency, for other places where the same logic might apply, for other files that might need the same treatment. The reassignment order came the next day. Different unit, different mission set, same level of responsibility, no loss of trajectory, no punitive language, just a clean transition that acknowledged my experience without referencing the disruption that had made it necessary. That too mattered. I signed the order and acknowledged receipt. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same act that had initiated review now closed the loop. When I reported to the new command, the welcome was professional and brief. The incoming briefing focused on priorities, expectations, and timelines. No one asked about my previous assignment. No one needed to. The system had already decided what belonged in the record and what didn't. Rebecca's correction didn't come as an announcement either. There was no demotion ceremony, no public reprimand. Just a quiet reassignment to a staff role that didn't involve command authority. It was the kind of move that looks lateral on paper, but feels very different in practice. In our world, command is trust. It's the organization saying you are allowed to make decisions that affect people's lives. Losing that trust doesn't require punishment to be felt. Rebecca wasn't disgraced. She wasn't accused. She was simply no longer in a position where discretionary judgments could carry unexamined consequences. That was the point. I didn't hear about it from her. I heard about it the same way everyone else did, through updates that didn't explain themselves. She didn't call, she didn't text, she didn't ask to talk. That silence wasn't avoidance. It was understanding. Family dynamics don't disappear when professional boundaries intervene. They just lose their leverage. Weeks passed. I settled into the new role quickly. Different unit, same fundamentals. Clear standards, documented guidance, predictable expectations. The kind of environment where leadership doesn't have to perform itself to feel valid. I noticed something else too. People started being more careful with their language, not guarded, precise. Concerns were documented. Counseling statements were written. Guidance followed up with email summaries. Meetings ended with notes that reflected decisions instead of interpretations. No one said it was because of me. No one needed to. The review had done what reviews are meant to do when they work properly. It reminded the organization of its own rules. One afternoon, as I was reviewing training schedules, a captain knocked on my door. "Ma'am," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. How did you handle it?" he asked. "When it happened." I looked at him for a moment and chose my words carefully. "I didn't handle it," I said. "I let the system do what it was supposed to do." He nodded slowly. That's it. He thanked me and left. That exchange stuck with me longer than I expected. People think revenge has to be loud to be satisfying. They expect confrontation, emotion, a clear winner and a clear loser. What they don't see is how powerful quiet correction can be when it's rooted in process instead of anger. I didn't take anything from Rebecca. I didn't damage her career. I didn't embarrass her in front of peers. I removed her ability to operate outside the rules she believed protected her. That wasn't personal, it was structural. The last update came at the end of the month. A brief note from legal closing the review. No further action required. I archived it and moved on. By then my life had settled into a rhythm again. New responsibilities, new faces. The same expectations. The base didn't remember the disruption. It rarely does. Institutions absorb corrections and keep moving. What changed wasn't visible on the surface. It lived in files, procedures, and the way decisions were justified going forward. That's what justice looks like here. Not punishment, not payback. Correction. And correction once made doesn't need to announce itself to be effective. The quiet that followed wasn't awkward, it was orderly. That was the first thing I noticed once the review officially closed and my calendar stopped filling itself with legal placeholders. No follow-ups, no clarifications, no final lessons learned briefings. Just space where noise used to be. The base returned to its usual rhythm quickly. Morning formations stayed on schedule. Staff meetings ran long in the ways they always had. People complained about the same things they complained about before. On the surface, nothing looked different. Underneath, everything was tighter. I saw it in how guidance was delivered. Conversations that used to end with, "You know what I mean?" now ended with, "I'll send that in writing." Counseling sessions that once stayed verbal suddenly had forms attached. Language shifted from vague to specific. Not because anyone had been told to change, but because they'd been reminded what ambiguity cost. No one mentioned my case. That wasn't avoidance. That was policy. The military doesn't process correction emotionally. It processes it procedurally. Once the file is fixed, the lesson moves into muscle memory. Rebecca remained quiet. We ran into each other once briefly at a family gathering we both had reasons not to miss. There were other people around. No uniforms, no rank. Just familiar furniture and conversations that pretended nothing had happened. She nodded at me. I nodded back. That was it. No apology, no confrontation, no attempt to explain or justify anything. Rebecca wasn't the type to confess regret, especially when the system hadn't labeled her wrong in a way that required it. What she'd lost wasn't status, it was discretion. She could still operate. She just couldn't operate unchecked. That kind of correction doesn't invite conversation, it invites adjustment. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved either. What I felt was something closer to equilibrium, the sense that things had settled where they were always supposed to be. Family dynamics didn't resolve themselves neatly. They never do, but the leverage was gone, and with it the need to manage proximity or tone. We existed in parallel lanes now connected by history, but no longer entangled by authority. In my new unit, the work demanded attention in ways that left little room for reflection. Different challenges, different expectations, same fundamentals. I noticed I was being watched more closely at first. Not suspiciously, carefully. People wanted to know how I'd lead without the shadow of what had happened following me into the room. I gave them nothing extra to interpret. Clear guidance, documented decisions, Consistent standards. The same approach that had worked before continued to work now. That was the point. One afternoon, while reviewing a set of evaluations, I realized I hadn't thought about the review in days. Not because I was avoiding it, but because it no longer required attention. That's how you know something is finished, not when it's explained, but when it stops asking to be processed. A junior officer came by later with a draft counseling statement and asked if it looked sufficient. It did. He thanked me and left without needing reassurance. That small moment said more than any official memo ever could. The system hadn't just corrected a decision. It had recalibrated behavior. I never received a personal acknowledgement from legal beyond the formal closure. I didn't expect one. Their job wasn't to validate experiences. It was to align outcomes with standards. They'd done that. What stayed with me wasn't the process itself, but how little effort it had required once it started. No raised voices, no accusations, no demands. Just records being read the way they were meant to be read. People talk about revenge as if it has to involve intent, planning, desire, satisfaction. What happened here didn't fit that definition. I didn't set out to retaliate. I didn't want to expose anyone. I didn't need to be proven right. I wanted the system to behave the way it claimed it did. It did. That distinction matters, because the real power in organizations like this isn't held by individuals, no matter how senior they are. It's held by processes that don't care who you are once they're engaged properly. The silence afterward wasn't emptiness, it was confirmation. Confirmation that the chain of command had been corrected without breaking. That family influence had been removed without spectacle. That authority had been reminded of its limits without being attacked. I didn't gain anything tangible from it. No promotion, no public recognition, no narrative to carry forward. What I kept was my record intact and accurate, and the ability to keep doing the work without distraction. That was enough. The last thing I archived wasn't a document, it was a habit. I stopped checking for updates that weren't coming anymore. Stopped listening for explanations that weren't necessary. Stopped bracing for reactions that had already resolved themselves. The system moved on, so did I. And somewhere in the quiet that followed the lesson, settled where it belonged, not as a story to be retold, but as a correction that didn't need repeating.